The December wind cut through Chicago like a blade, but inside the Sentinel Hotel ballroom, the air was thick with champagne and calculated smiles. Jesse James wasn't supposed to be here. He had received no invitation to this engagement party. But when his intelligence network whispered that his ex-wife would be present, nothing could have kept him away. Not protocol. Not strategy. Not the voice in his head warning him that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. He stood in the arched entrance, and the effect was immediate. Conversations died mid-sentence. Crystal glasses paused halfway to painted lips. The string quartet's music seemed to fade into the background. Everyone in Chicago's criminal underworld knew that face. The hard jaw. The steel-gray eyes that had watched empires rise and fall. The tailored midnight suit that fit like armor. Jesse James. Third-generation leader of the most powerful syndicate in the Midwest. The man who controlled everything from the waterfront shipping operations to the political machinery that kept the city running. He wasn't here for business. He was here because fate has a cruel way of orchestrating the most devastating reunions when we're least prepared to face them. His eyes scanned the crowd with predatory precision, moving past the politicians in expensive tuxedos, past the socialites dripping in diamonds, past the rival family representatives maintaining their fragile truces. Then his gaze locked on the raised platform at the center of the ballroom, and the world stopped. Marilyn Monroe stood beside Charles Manson, her hand resting on his arm in what should have been an intimate gesture. But Jesse saw the tension in her shoulders. The forced smile. The way her eyes didn't quite meet anyone's gaze. She wore a silver gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, elegant and expensive. But no amount of expert tailoring could hide what Jesse saw immediately. What stopped his heart and restarted it with a violent, painful rhythm. 8 months pregnant. Unmistakably, undeniably, impossibly pregnant. The timeline crashed through his mind like breaking glass. 8 months. They had been divorced for 8 months. The math was brutal and precise. That child, the one she was carrying, the one that made her glow even through her obvious distress, that was his baby. Marilyn, he said her name quietly, but in the sudden silence of the ballroom, it carried like a gunshot. Her head turned. Their eyes met across 50 feet of polished marble floor and 200 witnesses. The color drained from her face. The champagne flute in her free hand trembled, the liquid inside creating tiny waves. For a moment, she looked like she might faint. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, a protective gesture that Jesse recognized immediately. She was shielding their child. From him. As if he were the danger. As if he were the threat. The engagement ring on her finger caught the light like a distress signal. A massive diamond that screamed of ownership, of claims, of a future that couldn't possibly be real. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, but in the deadly quiet, everyone heard it. Charles Manson's head snapped toward Jesse, recognition flaring in his eyes. Then calculation. His hand tightened possessively on Marilyn's arm, and Jesse saw her wince. Saw the fear flash across her face before she smoothed it into careful neutrality. The kind of neutrality that came from practice. From survival. The ballroom held its breath. Security personnel shifted their weight, hands moving toward concealed weapons. The rival family representatives exchanged glances, reading the temperature of the room, calculating whether this confrontation would escalate into something that would demand their involvement. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't a casual interruption. This was a detonation. Jesse took his first step forward. Then another. He moved through the crowd like a shark through water. People parted before him without conscious thought, creating a clear path to the platform. To Marilyn. To answers that had been kept from him for 8 months. "That child," he said, his voice low and dangerous, carrying the weight of absolute authority. His eyes never left Marilyn's face. "Whose child is that? If you're feeling the electricity of this moment, the danger crackling in the air, you need to stay with me. Drop a comment right now telling me if you've ever discovered a truth that shattered everything you thought you knew." Because what happens in the next 60 seconds will change 3 lives forever. And I promise you, the revelations coming will hit harder than anything you're expecting. Subscribe now because this isn't just another reunion story. This isn't some romantic drama where misunderstandings get cleared up over coffee. This is about betrayal so calculated it destroyed a marriage. This is about conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of Chicago's criminal infrastructure. This is about a woman 8 months pregnant, trapped between the man she was forced to leave and the monster who holds her sister's life in his hands. This is about discovering that the divorce you signed, the abandonment you believed in, the heartbreak you carried, was all a lie. A manufactured deception designed to destroy you both. Make sure you're subscribed because what I'm about to reveal will turn everything upside down. The betrayal didn't come from where you think. The villain wasn't the obvious one. And the price for 8 months of lies is about to come due in the most dramatic way possible, because Marilyn is about to go into premature labor. Right here. Right now. In front of everyone. Let me take you back 8 months to help you understand the magnitude of this moment. To show you how 2 people who loved each other more than life itself were torn apart by someone they both trusted. Someone who played them both like instruments in an orchestra of destruction. Because before Marilyn was standing on that platform in a silver gown with a ring she never wanted on her finger, before Jesse became the coldest, most ruthless version of himself that even his own people feared, they were something else entirely. They were happy. They were in love. They were building something beautiful in secret, away from the violence and power games. And understanding what they had, what they lost, and how it was stolen from them, that's the only way to truly grasp why this reunion isn't just dramatic. It's explosive. It's dangerous. And it might just cost them everything they have left to lose, including their lives and the life of their unborn child. Marilyn Monroe grew up with the sound of waves crashing against rock and the steady beam of light cutting through Atlantic darkness. The Montauk Lighthouse had been her family's charge for 3 generations. Her father maintained the historical landmark while her mother gave tours to tourists who came to see where George Washington had ordered the light built in 1796. Marilyn spent her childhood climbing the 137 steps to the top, doing homework in the keeper's quarters, falling asleep to the rhythm of the foghorn on misty nights. She was 15 when the car accident took both her parents on a rain-slicked highway returning from the mainland. One moment she had a family. The next she was an orphan with a 10-year-old sister and a grandmother too frail to work. The lighthouse keeper position went to someone else. The grace period in their housing lasted 60 days. Marilyn learned what survival meant. She worked the morning shift at the diner on the pier, afternoon shift at the grocery store, night shift cleaning vacation rentals after tourists checked out. Delilah never missed a meal. Never wore shoes with holes. Never knew how close they came each month to losing everything. Marilyn made sure of that. She attended community college classes between shifts, studied journalism in stolen hours, graduated with honors while Delilah still believed their lives were normal. The protectiveness that developed during those years became part of Marilyn's DNA. She would do anything, sacrifice anything, endure anything to keep Delilah safe. It was the kind of love that made you strong. The kind that made you vulnerable. The kind that, years later, a man like Declan Cross could weaponize with surgical precision. At 24, with Delilah accepted to college and a scholarship covering tuition, Marilyn finally pursued her dream. The Chicago Tribune hired her for their investigative unit based on a piece she had written exposing corruption in Long Island's fishing industry. She wanted to give voice to the voiceless. To expose the powerful people who crushed ordinary lives without consequence. To make the kind of impact that would have saved families like hers. She specialized in organized crime because that's where power and corruption intersected most visibly. That's where politicians and criminals shook hands in the shadows. That's where money laundered through legitimate businesses destroyed neighborhoods. She was fearless in her pursuit of truth. Unintimidated by threats. Unwilling to be bought or scared away. Which is exactly how she ended up sitting across from Jesse James in his downtown office, asking questions no one else dared to ask. Looking into eyes that had seen violence she couldn't imagine. not knowing that this interview would change the trajectory of her entire life. Jesse James never wanted to be king of anything. He wanted to be an architect. He had been accepted to MIT with a full scholarship, had plans to design buildings that would reshape skylines, to create something beautiful instead of inheriting something built on blood. But legacies don't care about dreams. They care about succession. About power passing from father to son in an unbroken line that stretched back 3 generations. His grandfather had built the empire during Prohibition, running speakeasies and bootleg operations that became the foundation of everything that followed. His father expanded into legitimate businesses, construction and trucking and waste management, using them to launder money and extend control. By the time Jesse was born, the James name meant power in Chicago. It meant politicians returned your calls. Police looked the other way. Rivals calculated carefully before making moves. Jesse was 26 when his father was assassinated in the parking garage of his own downtown office building. 3 shots from a sniper who was never found. The funeral drew 1,000 mourners. The transfer of power happened within 72 hours. There was no time to grieve. No space to process. Jesse walked out of his father's memorial service and directly into a war room where the organization's leadership demanded he prove he could lead or watch everything collapse into chaos. He proved it. But not the way they expected. Jesse didn't rely on brutality and street violence like the old guard. He modernized. Invested in technology and information networks. Built intelligence systems that told him what rivals were planning before they made their moves. He reduced the body count because bodies attracted federal attention and federal attention was bad for business. He was more dangerous than his father precisely because he was smarter, colder, more calculated. But the throne was lonely. Every conversation carried hidden agendas. Every smile masked calculation. People wanted his power or feared his wrath, and Jesse couldn't tell which was worse. He trusted no one. Couldn't afford to. In his world, trust was the luxury that got you killed. Except for Declan Cross. They had grown up together, 2 boys from the neighborhood who became men in the same violent world. Declan had been there the night Jesse's father died. Had stood beside him during the transition. Had proven his loyalty 1,000 times over the years. If Jesse had a brother, it was Declan. If he had anyone he could trust with his life, it was Declan. That belief, that trust, that certainty would become the weapon Declan used to destroy him. Marilyn walked into Jesse's office on a Tuesday morning with a leather portfolio and questions that would have made most people nervous to even write down. His assistant had tried to screen her, to soften her edges, to explain that Mr. James granted very few interviews and expected a certain level of respect. Marilyn had smiled politely and walked past her into the corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. Jesse looked up from his desk, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. Then he saw her. Not her appearance, though she was beautiful in a way that didn't rely on effort. But the way she held herself. The directness in her gaze. The complete absence of fear in her posture as she sat down across from him without being invited. She opened with a question about the construction contract for the new federal courthouse. How his company had underbid every competitor by margins that seemed mathematically impossible. Whether he considered that good business or systematic corruption. Her voice was steady. Professional. Unintimidated. Jesse leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same attention he gave to contracts worth millions. Most journalists who managed to get this far asked softball questions, too afraid of consequences to push for real answers. This woman looked at him like he was a puzzle she intended to solve. He gave her carefully worded responses. Nothing incriminating. Nothing that could be used against him. But enough substance that she couldn't dismiss him as just another criminal hiding behind lawyers. He explained the economics of scale. The efficiency of vertical integration. The reality that sometimes the lowest bid was simply the best bid. He watched her take notes, watched her process his answers, watched her formulate follow-up questions that revealed she had done extensive research. The interview lasted 90 minutes. When she left, Jesse sat in his office longer than necessary, thinking about the intelligence in her questions and the way she had refused to be charmed or intimidated or dismissed. When she published the piece 2 weeks later, he read it 3 times. It wasn't a hit piece. It wasn't a puff piece either. It was nuanced, acknowledging the complexity of power in Chicago without excusing the violence that made it possible. She had quoted him accurately. Had presented his perspective fairly. Had still managed to raise uncomfortable questions about the systems that allowed men like him to exist. Jesse called her the next day. Told her there was a detail in the article that needed clarification. It was a lie. The article was flawless. He just wanted to hear her voice again. Wanted another round of their intellectual chess game. Wanted to see if she would agree to dinner. She did. And neither of them saw the trap closing until it was far too late. They met at midnight on the lakefront where the city lights reflected off dark water and no one from Jesse's world would think to look for him. Marilyn would finish her evening shift at the Tribune and drive to the abandoned pier near Montrose Harbor. Jesse would arrive in an unmarked car, leaving his security detail blocks away, stealing hours that belonged only to them. They talked about everything. She challenged his assumptions about power, arguing that control without purpose was just destruction wearing an expensive suit. He showed her the impossible math of his position, the families whose livelihoods depended on his organization, the gang wars that would erupt if his control weakened, the chaos that his presence actually prevented. She didn't excuse it. But she began to understand it. He took her to small restaurants in neighborhoods far from his territory. Places where he was just another man in a booth with a beautiful woman. Where she could laugh without calculating who was watching. Where they could be Jesse and Marilyn instead of the Mafia boss and the journalist who should have been enemies. 6 months into their relationship, Jesse proposed in his car overlooking the city from a hilltop in Lincoln Park. No grand gesture. No elaborate planning. Just a simple question and a ring he had carried in his pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Marilyn said yes before he finished asking. They married at a courthouse in Evanston on a Thursday afternoon with only Delilah as witness. The clerk who performed the ceremony had no idea who Jesse was. The marriage license was filed under his legal name that appeared nowhere in news articles or police databases. They planned to announce it publicly once Jesse consolidated his position, once the internal power struggle settled, once it was safe for her to be known as his wife. Jesse bought a townhouse in Wicker Park under a shell corporation. 3 bedrooms. A kitchen with morning light. A small garden in back. It became their sanctuary. The place where he wasn't the boss but simply her husband. Where he cooked breakfast on Sunday mornings. Where she worked on freelance articles at the dining room table. Where they fell asleep tangled together and woke up believing that somehow they could build a life that existed outside his world. For 6 months, they lived in stolen happiness. 6 months where Marilyn believed that love could be stronger than legacy. 6 months where Jesse allowed himself to imagine a different future. Then Declan discovered the marriage. And those 6 months became the last happiness either of them would know for a very long time. Declan Cross found out about the marriage the way he found out about everything, through the network of informants and surveillance he had built over 15 years of being Jesse's right hand. A clerk in Evanston who recognized Jesse's face despite the alias. A property record that traced back through enough shell corporations to reveal the pattern. A night surveillance photo of Jesse entering a townhouse in Wicker Park that wasn't on any of his known property lists. Declan sat in his car outside that townhouse at 3 in the morning, watching the darkened windows, and felt something cold and calculating settle into place. He had spent his entire adult life in Jesse's shadow. They had grown up together, 2 boys from the same neighborhood. But Jesse had inherited an empire while Declan inherited the role of enforcer. The problem solver. The one who got his hands dirty while Jesse kept his clean. Jesse made the decisions. Declan made them happen. Jesse attended meetings with politicians and business leaders. Declan disappeared the people who became problems. Jesse built wealth. Declan built body counts. And for what? Loyalty? Friendship? The privilege of watching his childhood friend become everything Declan would never be? The marriage changed everything. Marilyn represented exactly what a leader in their world could not afford. Weakness. Distraction. Vulnerability. A pressure point that enemies could exploit. Jesse had become sloppy, emotional, human. And human was dangerous in a world where sharks circled constantly, looking for blood in the water. Declan saw opportunity where others might have seen romance. If Jesse was compromised by love, then Jesse was compromised. And a compromised leader was a liability the organization couldn't afford. He made contact with Charles Manson through intermediaries. The Detroit boss had been looking for a way into Chicago's territory for years. Declan offered him a path. Help destabilize Jesse's position, create the chaos that would force the organization to question his leadership, and Detroit could expand into operations Jesse would be too distracted to defend. But the plan required removing Marilyn from the equation. Not permanently, that would make Jesse a martyr to his own heartbreak and rally the organization behind him. No, she needed to leave voluntarily. To hurt him in a way that would make him weak, angry, reckless. Declan researched Marilyn's history with the same thoroughness he brought to eliminating threats. The dead parents. The childhood responsibility. The sister she had raised alone. Delilah Monroe, 22 years old, graduate student in psychology, living in Portland on a modest stipend. Perfect. Young. Isolated. Unprotected. The perfect leverage against a woman whose entire identity was built on protecting the people she loved. Declan made his plans carefully. And when Jesse left for New York to meet with East Coast families, Declan made his move. Declan came to the townhouse on a Wednesday evening while Jesse was in New York negotiating with the Calabrese family. Marilyn answered the door expecting a delivery and found Jesse's closest friend standing on her doorstep with an envelope and an expression she couldn't read. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He walked past her into the living room she had decorated with framed photos and throw pillows, things that made the space feel like a home instead of a safe house. He placed the envelope on the coffee table. Opened it. Spread the contents across the surface with clinical precision. Divorce papers. Jesse's signature at the bottom, bold and unmistakable. She would have recognized that signature anywhere. Declan's voice was calm, almost kind, as he explained. Jesse had realized the marriage was a mistake. She was a liability he couldn't afford. A distraction that made him vulnerable. He had decided to end it cleanly before it became a problem that required messier solutions. Declan was there as a friend, to both of them, to make sure this happened quietly. Civilly. Without unnecessary complications. Marilyn stared at the signature, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. This had to be a mistake. Jesse loved her. They were building a life together. They had talked about the future just 3 nights ago. Then Declan placed photographs on the table. Jesse outside a restaurant in Manhattan with a woman Marilyn had never seen. Jesse's hand on her lower back. The woman laughing at something he said. Another photo of them entering a hotel. The timestamps were from 2 nights ago. The images hit harder than any physical blow. Declan pulled out his phone. Showed her more photos. Delilah walking across the Portland campus. Delilah at a coffee shop. Delilah entering her apartment building. The message was clear without being spoken. Your sister is very exposed out there. Very vulnerable. Very easy to reach. He slid the divorce papers closer. Pointed to the signature line. Explained that if she signed now, if she left quietly, Delilah would never need to know this happened. She would be safe. Protected. Untouched by the world Marilyn had foolishly tried to join. If she didn't sign, well, Jesse had other ways of handling problems. And Declan would be very sad to see Delilah become one of those problems. Marilyn's hand shook as she picked up the pen. 3 weeks pregnant with a child she didn't yet know existed. She signed her name. Watched Declan gather the papers. Listened to him tell her she had until morning to be gone. She packed what she could carry. Left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter. Drove through the night to Portland with tears blurring the highway lines. And didn't look back because looking back would break something inside her that would never heal. And this is where it gets even more devastating. Because what Marilyn doesn't know yet, what Jesse doesn't know, is that they're both about to suffer in ways that will change them forever. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now because the parallel pain they're about to experience will break your heart. And the moment when truth finally collides with lies? You absolutely cannot miss it. Marilyn discovered she was pregnant 6 weeks after leaving Chicago. She had been living in a studio apartment 3 blocks from Delilah's campus, taking freelance writing assignments that paid just enough to cover rent and groceries. The nausea she had attributed to stress and grief turned out to be something else entirely. She sat on the bathroom floor staring at the positive test, and the sob that came from her throat sounded like something breaking. She was carrying Jesse's child. The baby they had talked about in whispered conversations late at night. The family they had planned to build once it was safe. Except now there was no family. No Jesse. No future. Just her and this tiny life growing inside her that would never know its father. Every day she battled the urge to call him. To tell him about the baby. To ask if Declan had been telling the truth. But the photos stopped her. The signature on the divorce papers. The implicit threat against Delilah. She couldn't risk it. Couldn't gamble her sister's safety on the possibility that she had misunderstood. So she poured her energy into preparing for the baby instead. Attended prenatal appointments alone. Built a crib by herself using YouTube tutorials. Created a life from ruins because that's what she had always done. Survived. Endured. Protected the people she loved even when it destroyed her. Jesse returned from New York to find the townhouse empty. Marilyn's clothes gone from the closet. Her toiletries missing from the bathroom. The coffee mug she used every morning absent from the dish rack. And divorce papers on the kitchen counter beside her wedding ring, his signature at the bottom of documents he had never seen before. Declan was waiting when Jesse called, his story perfectly constructed. Marilyn had been using him. She was an investigative journalist, remember? This had been her story all along. She had been seen meeting with federal prosecutors. Had taken a substantial payoff to disappear before her testimony could damage the organization. The marriage had been a long con. Jesse had been played by someone smarter than he'd given her credit for. Jesse's heartbreak curdled into rage. Then the rage cooled into something worse. Empty. Cold. The part of him that had believed in love, that had imagined a different future, died in that townhouse kitchen. He threw himself into expansion. Took territory. Crushed rivals. Became more ruthless than his father had ever been. People who had known him before whispered that something fundamental had changed. That the humanity had been carved out of him. That he had become exactly the monster everyone had always feared he would be. Neither of them knew they were both victims of the same lie. Both suffering the same loss. Both building walls around hearts that would take a miracle to reach again. The call came at 2 in the morning when Marilyn was 6 months pregnant and finally sleeping through the night without crying. A nurse from Detroit Medical Center. Calm. Professional. Delilah had been in a serious car accident. She was stable but asking for her sister. Marilyn needed to come immediately. Marilyn drove through the night, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her mind replaying every conversation she'd had with Delilah over the past months. Had she sounded stressed? Distracted? Had there been warning signs Marilyn had missed while drowning in her own grief? She arrived at the hospital at dawn, exhausted and terrified, and was directed to a private waiting room on the 4th floor. The door opened. But it wasn't a doctor who walked in. Charles Manson looked exactly like his reputation suggested. Expensive suit. Cold eyes. The smile of a man who enjoyed other people's fear. He sat down across from her as if they were meeting for coffee instead of in a hospital where her sister supposedly lay injured. Delilah was fine, he said. There had been no accident. Just a necessary fiction to get Marilyn where he needed her. She was in Detroit now. His territory. His rules. He explained his proposition with the casual tone of someone ordering lunch. She would marry him. Provide legitimacy and a connection to Jesse's world. In return, Delilah would remain safe. Untouched. Free to finish her degree and live her life. If Marilyn refused, well, the fabricated accident could become very real. And next time there would be no phone call. Just a funeral. Manson outlined his plan as if she should be impressed by the strategy. He would use Marilyn and the baby as leverage to negotiate a merger with Jesse's organization. The marriage would create legal and territorial entanglements that would force cooperation. Jesse would have to choose between his empire and his ex-wife. Either way, Manson expanded into Chicago. He gave her a week to agree. Installed her in a luxury apartment with guards at the door who were there to keep her in, not to keep danger out. She was watched constantly. Her phone monitored. Her movements restricted. A prisoner in everything but name. What Marilyn didn't know was that Declan had sold this plan to Manson as a peaceful absorption of Jesse's empire. What Manson didn't know was that Declan's real goal was elimination. Once the marriage created the entanglement, once Jesse was emotionally compromised and legally vulnerable, Declan would orchestrate his permanent removal. The crown would pass to someone more suitable. Someone who had earned it through loyalty and blood. Someone like Declan himself. Marilyn sat in that apartment watching her belly grow, feeling her baby move, and tried to figure out how to protect everyone she loved when she had no power, no options, and no way out. Manson's security moved to intercept, hands reaching inside jackets toward concealed weapons. But Jesse's reputation made them hesitate just long enough for him to cross half the ballroom. Every eye tracked his movement. Every conversation had died. The string quartet had stopped playing mid-measure. The only sound was Jesse's footsteps on marble and the hammering of 200 hearts wondering if they were about to witness a war. He stopped 10 feet from the platform. Close enough to see the fear in Marilyn's eyes. Close enough to count the months in the curve of her belly. Close enough to know with absolute certainty that the child she carried was his. When were you going to tell me about my child? His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Marilyn's face drained of what little color remained. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. The shock in her expression told him everything he needed to know. She hadn't known he didn't know. She believed he had abandoned them. Believed he had chosen his empire over their baby. The baby is mine, Manson said, his hand tightening possessively on Marilyn's arm. She's carrying my child. You have no claim here. Jesse's gaze never left Marilyn's face. 8 months pregnant. They had been divorced for 8 months. The timeline was mathematically precise. That was his baby. His wife. His family that someone had stolen from him. Marilyn, he said quietly, tell me the truth. Her eyes filled with tears. I thought you knew, she whispered. I thought you didn't want us. The words hit Jesse like a physical blow. Before he could respond, before he could process what she meant, Marilyn gasped. Her free hand flew to her belly. Her face contorted in pain. Her water had broken. The liquid spread across the platform in a dark stain that made several guests step back. Contractions started immediately, her body doubling over, a cry escaping her lips that sounded like something primal and terrified. The medical emergency overrode everything else. Jesse moved without thinking. He was up the platform steps and lifting Marilyn into his arms before Manson could react. She was lighter than he expected, fragile despite the pregnancy, trembling against his chest. Get out of my way, Jesse said to the security personnel blocking the exit. Manson made the mistake of trying to stop him. He grabbed Jesse's shoulder. Jesse turned, Marilyn still in his arms, and the look in his eyes made Manson release him like he'd touched fire. Touch me again and you're dead. Touch her and there won't be enough of you left to bury. Jesse's men materialized from the crowd, creating a barrier between him and Manson's security. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Shouting. Movement. The crash of tables overturning. But Jesse was already through the door, racing toward his car with Marilyn clinging to him, her contractions coming faster than they should. He called his personal physician. Gave the address of his most secure safe house. And drove through Chicago like the devil himself was chasing them. The safe house was a renovated brownstone in Lincoln Park that appeared on no official records. Jesse carried Marilyn through the door as Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived with her medical bag and a nurse Jesse trusted. They transformed the master bedroom into an emergency delivery room while Marilyn's contractions came in waves that made her cry out despite her attempts to stay quiet. The doctor worked to slow the premature labor, administering medication, monitoring vital signs, her face showing concern she tried to hide. Marilyn was only 32 weeks. Too early. Too dangerous. But the baby had decided otherwise. Between contractions, Jesse sat beside the bed holding Marilyn's hand. And finally, they spoke with complete honesty. She told him about Declan's visit. The divorce papers with Jesse's signature. The photos of him with another woman in New York. The implicit threats against Delilah. The choice she had faced between believing he had abandoned her or risking her sister's life. Jesse's face went white. I never signed divorce papers, he said, his voice barely controlled. I never wanted you gone. Declan told me you were working with federal prosecutors. That you had used me for a story. That you took money to disappear. The full scope of the manipulation crystallized between them. Declan had played them both. Had manufactured evidence. Had used their love as a weapon to destroy them. Jesse made calls between Marilyn's contractions. Activated his technology specialists. Ordered a full audit of Declan's communications and financial records. His voice was ice as he gave instructions, but his hand never left Marilyn's. The labor progressed too quickly to stop. The medication had bought them time but not enough. Dr. Vasquez prepared for delivery, her expression serious. This baby was coming whether they were ready or not. Marilyn pushed through pain that felt like her body was being torn apart. Jesse stayed beside her, letting her grip his hand hard enough to bruise, murmuring words of encouragement that sounded desperate. Hours blurred together. Then suddenly a cry split the air. Small. Fierce. Alive. Dr. Vasquez lifted a tiny baby girl, impossibly small but breathing on her own. 4 pounds. Premature but fighting. She placed the baby in Jesse's arms while she attended to Marilyn. Jesse looked down at his daughter. Evangeline Rose James, Marilyn whispered, exhausted and overwhelmed. The name they had chosen in stolen conversations months ago. Something fundamental shifted in Jesse as he held that tiny life. She wasn't legacy or succession or empire. She was possibility. She was hope. She was a reason to be better than he had been. He promised Marilyn, as she drifted towards sleep, that he would end this. That their daughter would grow up in a different world. And that this time, he would do it right. While Marilyn recovered in the safe house with Evangeline sleeping in a bassinet beside her bed, Jesse worked from the study downstairs with the cold precision that had made him feared. His technology specialists cracked Declan's encrypted communications within 18 hours. What they found was comprehensive. Damning. Years of betrayal documented in digital fingerprints Declan had thought were untraceable. The original divorce documents with metadata showing the forgery. Communications between Declan and Manson detailing the planned takeover. Financial records proving Declan had been skimming profits for 3 years, siphoning money into offshore accounts to fund his coup. Photos of Delilah that Declan had commissioned. Recordings of conversations where he had coached Manson on how to manipulate Marilyn. Everything Jesse needed to destroy him. Jesse called a meeting of the organization's council. The 12 men who had served under his father and grandfather. The old guard who valued tradition and loyalty above all else. He presented the evidence methodically. Showed them the theft. The conspiracy. The planned alliance with Detroit that would have fractured everything their families had built. The council deliberated for less than an hour. The vote was unanimous. Declan Cross had violated the most sacred rule, loyalty to the family. The penalty was removal. Not by Jesse's hand, which would have looked like personal revenge, but by the council's judgment. The organization's justice. Jesse allowed them to handle it. He stayed at the safe house with Marilyn and Evangeline while Declan was summoned to a meeting he would not leave. Jesse never asked for details. Didn't need them. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. For Manson, Jesse took a different approach. He compiled comprehensive evidence of the Detroit boss's operations. Drug trafficking routes. Money laundering schemes. Murder-for-hire arrangements. Communications that proved conspiracy across state lines. He delivered it to federal prosecutors through untraceable digital channels, anonymous tips that came with enough corroboration to be impossible to ignore. The FBI raid happened at dawn on the third day. Manson was arrested in his own home, agents swarming his operation, seizing records, freezing accounts. His organization crumbled within hours as lieutenants fled or flipped to save themselves. The arrest made national news. The trial would take years. Manson would die in federal prison. Jesse never fired a single shot. Never gave an order that could be traced back to him. He proved what he had always known: information was more powerful than bullets. Strategy more effective than violence. When he returned upstairs, Marilyn was awake, holding Evangeline against her chest. She looked at him with questions in her eyes. "It's over," he said simply. And meant it. Justice has been served, but their story isn't over yet. There's still one more transformation that will determine whether Jesse and Marilyn can truly build something new from the ashes of everything they lost. If you've made it this far without subscribing, do it now. Because the ending of this story is going to show you what it really means to choose love over legacy, hope over history. 2 months after Evangeline's birth, Jesse called a meeting that would be remembered as the day everything changed. He stood before the organization's leadership in the same conference room where his father had once commanded absolute loyalty, and announced his intention to transition the James empire toward legitimate business. The silence that followed was deafening. He outlined his plan with the same strategic precision he had always applied to expansion. Real estate development in neighborhoods that needed revitalization. Private security consulting for corporations and high-net-worth individuals. Venture capital investments in technology startups. The empire's substantial assets would be redirected, laundered clean through time and legal channels, transformed into something his daughter could inherit without shame. The transition would take years. Perhaps a decade. But it began immediately. Those who could adapt to legal operations would be retrained, repositioned, given opportunities to build legitimate careers. Those who couldn't would be offered generous exits. Severance packages. References. A clean break. No one would be abandoned, but the old way of doing business was ending. Some walked out. Others stayed out of loyalty or curiosity or simple recognition that Jesse had never failed at anything he attempted. The criminal underworld watched with fascination and skepticism. But Jesse had made his choice. Evangeline would not grow up as he had, heir to blood money and brutal legacy. He proposed to Marilyn again on a Sunday morning in the safe house kitchen while she fed Evangeline. No grand gesture. Just honesty. He explained the challenges ahead. The enemies who remained. The slow, difficult road toward legitimacy. The reality that some stains never fully washed clean. He asked if she would build that future with him, knowing it wouldn't be easy. Marilyn looked at their daughter, then at Jesse, and said yes. Because she recognized that he was genuinely trying to change. That the man who had held her through labor and dismantled conspiracies without firing a shot was capable of becoming something more than his past. They married at the Montauk Lighthouse where Marilyn had grown up. A small ceremony with Delilah, baby Evangeline, and the few associates Jesse trusted who had chosen to walk the legitimate path with him. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before them as they exchanged vows, the lighthouse beam cutting through gathering dusk. Marilyn held Jesse's hand and thought about the 8 months she had spent believing she was protecting him by staying away. When what he had needed all along was her belief that he could be more than his inheritance. More than violence and power. More than the crown he never wanted. Together, they would build that future. One choice at a time. One day at a time. And their daughter would inherit possibility instead of empire.